Have you ever walked into your childhood home and felt like a ghost? That's how I feel every time I visit my mother. A few weeks ago, I was standing in her living room, staring at a new family portrait on the mantelpiece. Everyone was there: my mother, my brother David, his wife, everyone but me and my daughter. The absence was a physical ache, but the real turning point came when a family friend looked right at me and said, "David, your daughter has grown so fast." Before I could even correct her, my brother smiled and simply said, "Yes, she has." That was the moment I knew I wasn't just forgotten, I was being erased. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd consider subscribing to my channel, it would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how my mother's love became a lie, a beautifully crafted illusion that I spent a lifetime believing. It is the story of how a single act of kindness turned to dust, became the catalyst for me to finally stop fighting for a place at a table where my seat had always been an empty gesture, the beginning of the end, as these things often are, was not marked by a sudden, violent break, but by the quiet, familiar sting of being unseen, a slow erosion of my very existence. The drive to my mother Eleanor's house on that crisp autumn Saturday was a slow, deliberate descent into a world that felt both intimately familiar and deeply alien. I was behind the wheel, my hands gripping the leather, a low hum of anxiety in my chest that had become a constant companion on these trips. The air was promising the crisp chill of a new season, but the warmth of the sun on my skin felt like a cruel deception. As I turned onto the long, winding drive, the house appeared a sprawling colonial with deep red brick and perfectly manicured lawns that seemed to defy the season's fading colors. It was a monument to my mother's flawless taste and her meticulously curated life, a fortress of family perfection from which my daughter, Lily, and I were always subtly but consistently excluded. The moment I stepped through the front door, the air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken, expensive perfume, and a polite artificial warmth that never seemed to reach me. It was a sensory assault of a life I was not truly a part of. The low murmur of family chatter and the clinking of glasses felt like a physical barrier separating me from the others, a soundproof wall built of social pleasantries and a shared history that I was always on the outside of. My eyes, as they always did, were drawn to the fireplace. A new family portrait hung there, a massive, professionally shot photograph of my mother, my older brother David, and his wife, Clara. They were a vision of domestic bliss, their matching cream-colored sweaters, a uniform of their belonging. It was a perfect tableau of a family I was supposedly a part of, yet Lily and I were conspicuously absent. Our exclusion wasn't a simple oversight. It was a deliberate, brutal statement, a gaping, painful void in the carefully constructed family narrative. I felt the physical weight of that emptiness, a pressure in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. I stood there for a moment, a phantom in the house where I had spent my childhood, when an old family friend, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, approached me. Her smile was genuine, her eyes crinkling at the corners with what seemed like genuine affection. But when she spoke, her words were not for me. "Oh, David, your daughter has grown so fast," she said, her voice filled with a warmth meant for my brother, not for me. The words, intended as a compliment, landed like a physical blow. Before I could even open my mouth to correct her, to claim my own name and identity, David stepped forward, his smile practiced and easy. "Yes, she has," he replied, and in that single, effortless sentence, I was erased. I was no longer Sarah, his sister, but a nameless shadow, a ghost whose existence was a minor inconvenience to be glossed over. It was a quiet, insidious cruelty, the relentless, quiet, chipping away at my sense of self. I swallowed the bitter taste of rejection and went to find Lily, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. I found her in the garden, trying to chase a butterfly that, like me, seemed to flit just out of reach. A few days later, the real turning point arrived. It didn't come with a bang or a dramatic confrontation, but with a choked up whisper from Lily on the phone. "Mommy," she sobbed, her voice thick with tears and disbelief. "I found it." I knew instantly what she was talking about. For 7 long, dedicated months, Lily had been working on a clay sculpture for her grandmother's birthday. It was a beautiful, delicate monarch butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, a symbol of hope and transformation. She had spent countless hours in our garage, her small hands covered in clay, her face smudged with paint, her heart poured into every intricate detail. She'd wanted it to be perfect, a physical manifestation of her love, and now she had found it in a trash can in my mother's garage, shattered and broken into countless pieces. The discovery was more than just a broken piece of art. It was a broken promise, a cruel reflection of how our love and our very existence were viewed. It wasn't that my mother disliked the gift, it was that she didn't care enough to even pretend. The message was loud and clear. Your feelings are insignificant. Your love is worthless, and your place in this family is easily thrown away. The irony was not lost on me. A few days later, my mother called, her voice bright and cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "Sarah, can you help me find that old photo of you?" she asked. She was talking about a picture from my childhood, where I was proudly holding a clay sculpture of a tree I had worked on for months. "That little tree you made for me," she said, her voice dripping with a fabricated nostalgia. "I want my friend to see how talented you've always been." The words were a lie, a revision of history to place herself at the center of my story. The sculpture wasn't for her. It was a project for school, a source of great personal pride for me. I said nothing, but a cold, clear clarity settled over me. This wasn't just a moment of thoughtlessness. This was a pattern, a lifelong habit of my mother twisting the truth to fit her own self-serving narrative. That phone call was the final straw. It was the moment I stopped trying for so long. I had been fighting for a place in my family, for my mother's love, for my brother's respect. I had been trying to fill a void that wasn't mine to fill. On my mother's birthday, a text message from David arrived. "Hey, Sarah, are you and Lily coming?" The message felt more like an obligation than a genuine invitation. I didn't reply for an hour. The silence was my answer. When my mother called, her voice was filled with a forced cheerfulness. "Sarah, are you coming?" she asked again. "You and Lily are a part of this family." I could hear the desperation, the first crack in her perfectly constructed facade. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in my life, I chose myself. "Mom," I said, my voice steady. "I'm sorry, but we're busy." The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating void where all the unspoken words of a lifetime hung in the air. "Busy?" she asked, the cheerfulness gone. "Doing what?" "I'm teaching Lily how to sculpt," I said, a small, genuine smile forming on my lips. A new sculpture, just for us. After that, the calls from my mother became less frequent. David still called, but the conversations were strained, filled with awkward pauses and unspoken questions. The distance I had created was a physical and emotional chasm, a space I had carved out for myself and my daughter. We moved to a small house in the suburbs, a place with a quiet backyard and a studio where Lily and I could create art together without fear of it being discarded. The house was small, but it was ours, and in it, we were seen. Months passed. The silence from my mother grew louder, more insistent. One day, David came to visit, his face a mask of worry and exhaustion. He looked older, more tired. The carefully constructed confidence he had always worn now seemed to hang loose and ill-fitting. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Mom wants to see you. She's in the hospital." I looked at him, my heart a stone. "She remembers something," he continued, his eyes pleading, something about the sculpture, about the old photo. I knew what he meant. He meant that she was finally remembering me. Not as a reflection of herself, but as a person. A woman who had a life and a voice of her own. But it was too late. I looked at him and I said nothing. My silence was not a refusal. It was a statement. I was not a wound for her to heal, not a problem for her to solve. I was a person who had moved on. The silence was a canyon between us, a space that could no longer be filled by words or apologies. I had finally found my voice, and it was in the beautiful, powerful, and unyielding language of my own silence. I looked at David's tired, pleading eyes, and a flood of memories rushed back. Our childhood wasn't all bad. Not at first. There was a time when David and I were a team. I remember a summer afternoon. We must have been 8 and 10. Mom was hosting one of her garden parties, and she had meticulously arranged a centerpiece of delicate glass hummingbirds on the patio table. A sudden gust of wind sent them crashing to the ground. In a panic, we scrambled to collect the shattered pieces. He, the ever-responsible older brother, took the blame. I was running, and I knocked into the table, he'd said, his voice firm, shielding me. Mom's fury was a cold, sharp thing, but it was directed at him alone. I watched him endure it. And in that moment, I thought it was an act of brotherly love. But now, looking at his face, I saw it differently. I saw the beginning of a pattern, the first crack in his own sense of self, where he learned to take the fall for the sake of preserving Mom's fragile peace. He had become her protector, the one who bore the brunt of her perfectionism. And in doing so, he learned to sacrifice others like me to maintain the illusion. My childhood wasn't a shadow I was born into. It was a shadow David and I created together, a place where he was the sun, and I was the ghost in his light. The day misses. Gable mistook me for his daughter wasn't an isolated incident. It was a culmination of a lifetime of being overlooked, and David's casual erasure was the final nail in the coffin. I remember a high school awards ceremony. I had won the prize for an essay on American literature. David, the star athlete, had won a trophy for football. When Mom got home, she was beaming. "David, your trophy looks magnificent on the mantel," she'd gushed. My certificate lay on the counter, a forgotten piece of paper. David, to his credit, had tried. "Mom, Sarah won something today too," he'd said, his voice a little tentative. But Mom had simply waved her hand. "Yes, honey, that's nice. But David's trophy is a real achievement. People will see that." David had shrugged, a quiet admission of defeat, and turned to me with a look of shared, weary resignation. That shared look, I now realized, was not solidarity. It was a signal that this was the way things were, and I should simply accept it. He was a co-conspirator in my invisibility. Lily's butterfly sculpture was a different kind of project. It wasn't for a prize or a grade. It was an act of pure, unadulterated love. Every morning, before school, she would sneak into the garage, her small hands smudging clay, her brow furrowed in concentration. She told me about the butterfly, how it represented Grandma Eleanor. "Grandma is a butterfly. Mom," she'd said with the kind of innocent wisdom only children possess. "She's so beautiful and she can fly anywhere she wants. I want this butterfly to show her how much I love her, and that she can be even more beautiful." I remember the day she finished it. Her face was a canvas of smudges and triumph. She had painted the wings with a pearlescent paint that shimmered in the sunlight filtering through the garage window. It was perfect. She had carefully wrapped it in tissue paper and put it in a box, a sacred object to be presented to her grandmother on her birthday. When she told me she found it in the trash, her voice wasn't just sad, it was broken. It was the sound of a little girl's faith in the world, in her family, crumbling to dust. She didn't just lose a sculpture. She lost the belief that her love was valuable. That night, she couldn't sleep. I held her close, stroking her hair, the tears soaking through my shirt. "Mommy," she whispered, "did she not like my butterfly? Was it ugly?" The question was a dagger to my heart. No, sweetie, I said, my voice thick with emotion. It wasn't ugly, it was the most beautiful butterfly I've ever seen. But sometimes people don't know how to see things. It's not about the butterfly, it's about them. It was the first time I had to explain to her the pain of being unseen. I wasn't just comforting a child, I was healing a wound in myself that had festered for decades. When David came to visit, his face a mask of worry and exhaustion, I saw him not as my brother, but as a ghost of the boy who took the blame for the shattered hummingbirds. He was no longer the son. He was a man caught in the shadow of his own making. "Mom wants to see you. She's in the hospital," he said, the words heavy with a burden he could no longer carry alone. "She remembers something about the sculpture, about the old photo." His eyes were pleading, but I saw no genuine remorse, only desperation. He wasn't asking for me to forgive him or Mom, he was asking me to come back and fix it, to fill the void that my absence had created, to restore the carefully constructed illusion of the perfect family. I looked at him, and I saw the little boy who had protected me from a glass storm, but I also saw the man who had let me be erased. I remembered the award ceremony, the way he shrugged, telling me without words that I just had to accept my place. I remembered the day misses. Gable spoke, and his quick, easy lie. He wasn't my protector. He was Mom's accomplice. I shook my head slowly. "David," I said, my voice a quiet whisper that held the weight of a lifetime. "I'm not a part of that story anymore." He flinched as if I had physically struck him. "What do you mean you're her daughter?" "No," I corrected him gently. "I was her supporting character. And I'm not playing that part anymore." I saw the confusion in his eyes, the dawning horror that the foundation of his own life, the one built on his role as the golden son, was crumbling. He tried to argue, to explain, but "She's sick. Sarah, she wants to make things right." "She wants to fill a hole I left," I countered, my voice firm, "and I'm not a bandage for her wounds." The silence that followed was a canyon between us, a space that could no longer be filled by words or apologies. I was not a wound for her to heal, not a problem for her to solve. I was a person who had moved on. As he turned to leave, his shoulders slumped. He looked back at me one last time. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely audible, "I'm sorry." But it wasn't an apology for all the times he'd let me be unseen. It was an apology for his own brokenness, for the fragile illusion he had helped build, and for the fact that he was finally, truly, alone in it. I had finally found my voice, and it was in the beautiful, powerful, and unyielding language of my own silence. I had chosen myself, and in doing so, I had not only saved myself, but had also shown Lily that her value, her love, and her art were sacred things, not to be discarded by anyone, for any reason. We were not a broken family. We were a family made whole, and our love was no longer a lie, but a beautiful truth, one we were finally free to create for ourselves. The truth, as it so often does, was far more complex than a simple narrative of good versus evil. My mother, Eleanor, was not a monster. She was a woman who had lived her entire life in a self-imposed prison of her own making. Her need for perfection wasn't just a personality quirk. It was a desperate attempt to control a world she felt was constantly slipping through her fingers. I remember her mother, my grandmother, a formidable woman with a sharp tongue and a gaze that could wither a garden. My grandmother never hugged Eleanor, never praised her, never told her she was enough. Instead, she spoke in terms of potential and improvement. Eleanor's childhood was a constant performance, a desperate dance to earn a love that was never freely given. She learned to curate every aspect of her life, from the precise arrangement of her furniture to the flawless grades on her report cards, believing that if she could just be perfect enough, the love would follow. David was her masterpiece. He was everything she had been told to be: handsome, athletic, charming, a social butterfly. He was the golden trophy, the living proof that her life's work had paid off. His achievements were her achievements. When he won, she won. His successes validated her own existence. I, on the other hand, was a messy, creative child. I loved mud, paint, and strange, intricate projects that didn't fit into any neat category. My art was a reflection of my inner world, wild, unkempt, and deeply personal. It was everything my mother feared. My existence was a constant, subtle challenge to the perfect facade she had worked so hard to build. She couldn't display my messy, prize-winning tree sculpture next to David's gleaming football trophy because it didn't fit the narrative. It wasn't a win for her. It was a win for me, a triumph she couldn't claim. And so she did what she learned to do. She began to edit me out, not with cruelty, but with a quiet, insidious neglect. My accomplishments were minimized. My presence was an afterthought. The family portrait without Lily and me wasn't just a slight. It was a symbolic act of her life's work. She was literally cutting the imperfections out of the picture. Her fabricated memory of my tree sculpture being a gift for her wasn't a malicious lie. It was a desperate attempt to rewrite my story so that it served her own narrative, a way of proving to herself that even my messy, inconvenient existence was, in some small way, about her. The old family friend, Mrs. Gable, was more than just a passing character in the story. She was a quiet witness, a silent keeper of secrets, and a woman who, in her own way, was trapped in the same web of perfection. I remember Mrs. Gable's house. It was full of beautiful, delicate things that no one was allowed to touch. She had a collection of porcelain dolls that she would clean and rearrange daily. As a child, I always felt a kind of kinship with those dolls, beautiful, fragile, and utterly lifeless, meant only to be looked at, never held. Years later, I would learn the truth about Mrs. Gable. She had a daughter named Mary, a talented musician who, in her late teens, had left home to pursue her passion, a path her mother had vehemently opposed. Mary's room was left untouched, a museum of a life that could have been Mrs. Gable's genuine warmth and affection for me. A creative herself was her own quiet way of mourning the relationship she had lost. When she called me David's daughter, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a projection of her own regrets. She saw in David the child who stayed, the child who conformed, and in me, she saw the child who had, in her mind, been lost. A few weeks after I stopped taking my mother's calls, I received a letter. It was from Mrs. Gable. The handwriting was shaky, the paper thin. "My dear Sarah," it began, "I have always admired your spirit. You have a fire that my Mary had, a fire I foolishly tried to extinguish. Your mother, Eleanor, is a woman who has spent her life trying to paint a picture that doesn't exist. She tried to make David the perfect portrait, and she tried to paint over you. Do not let her." The letter went on to tell me a secret she had held for decades. "The night your father left," she wrote, "he came to my house. He told me he was tired of being a prop in Eleanor's life. He told me he was leaving so he could finally be a real person, not just a husband in a perfect picture. He asked me to tell you that he loved you and that he hoped you would never let anyone silence your voice, the way he had allowed Eleanor to silence his." The letter was a revelation, a sudden, blinding flash of light that illuminated the entire, terrible tapestry of my childhood. My father hadn't just left. He had escaped. He had left a message for me, a message that had been lost for a lifetime. Mrs. Gable, with her quiet observations and her own bitter regrets, had been the one to finally deliver it. The letter changed everything. It didn't make me angry. It made me free. My father's silent legacy wasn't a broken family, but a whispered warning. He had chosen to run, but he had given me the courage to stay and fight, not for a place at their table, But for my own, I called David. The conversation was no longer strained. It was a raw, honest dialogue that had been waiting to happen for 40 years. I read him the part of the letter about my father. I could hear his sharp intake of breath. I thought he left because of us, he said, his voice breaking. I thought he left because he couldn't handle the pressure of being a father to a son and a daughter. I told him that wasn't true. I told him he was a victim of the same lie I was, just in a different way. I didn't forgive him that day. Forgiveness was a journey we would have to take together, a long road of unlearning and relearning. But we started. He began to call me not just to check in, but to talk. He talked about his wife, Clara, and the pressure she felt to be the perfect daughter-in-law. He talked about his own struggles with the carefully constructed persona he had worn for so long. We were no longer golden son and ghost daughter. We were just David and Sarah, two people trying to find our way out of the same maze. Eleanor passed away a few months later. David and I stood together at her funeral, not as a united front, but as two individuals mourning a complex, broken woman who had shaped our lives in profound and often painful ways. We stood in front of the same fireplace where the perfect family portrait had hung, a portrait that had long since been taken down. After the service, I found a small box on the mantel. It was from Eleanor. Inside was a framed photo. It was the one from my childhood, the one with me holding the tree sculpture. But it wasn't the picture I remembered. On the back, in Eleanor's shaky, unfamiliar handwriting, were the words, "My Sarah, my artist, I am sorry I could not see your tree. I was too busy trying to be a perfect garden." It was a small, fragile piece of truth, a crack in the fortress she had built around herself, a whisper of a mother's love I had never known. I put the photo in my bag, a quiet, personal treasure. It was not a grand apology, but it was an acknowledgement. I looked at David, and he looked back at me, our gazes meeting not with resentment, but with a shared understanding. The silence between us was no longer a canyon, but a space we were slowly, carefully, learning to fill with honest words. That night, Lily and I sat in our small studio, the scent of fresh clay filling the air. She was working on a new sculpture, a vibrant piece of abstract art that was a riot of color and shape. It wasn't a butterfly. It wasn't a tree. It was a new creation, born not from a desire to please, but from a joy to create. I looked at her, my beautiful, resilient daughter, her small hands covered in clay, and I knew that our story wasn't one of a broken past, but one of a beautifully, imperfectly whole future. The tapestry of our family was still unraveling, but we were finally free to weave our own new threads. The end of my mother's story was not the end of mine. It was the beginning,